We adopted or were introduced to servant leadership in 2007 and kind of did it on a trial basis. And, ultimately, I remember being in the crowd at that point as a young district manager for Waste Connections, thinking this is a pretty natural extension for me of how I led people on a daily basis, and just said, hey, I'm going to take some of this stuff and run with it and find ways to get better. And it was almost a year later that at the time senior leadership had said, specifically our CEO and founder Ron Mittelstadt had said, hey, look, we're no longer going to make this an option. This is how we're going to lead people at Waste Connections. And what he had seen in that year was ultimately those that truly adapted to servant leadership outperformed those that didn't. And servant leadership can be called a lot of different things. Sometimes folks think about it as being more of a soft take on leadership. But for us, it can be described in a number of different ways. I think simply said, it's, being humble as a leader and making great things happen for other people. That's ultimately how I like to think about it on a daily basis. Is my job is to provide the tools, education, and resources for those that I have the ability to serve at Waste Connections so that they can perform and ultimately within our vision as a self-directed, empowered employee, they can perform at their highest level and be successful. It's really taking that typical hierarchical management pyramid and inverting it and thinking of it as leaders, we support those that are all the way out to the front line, and ultimately for our business, the men and women that are out collecting the garbage from the residential homes or the commercial or industrial customer. And servant leadership is about caring for others, knowing your team, building relationships, which ultimately is trust. And we believe that those relationships lead to both loyalty and results. Coming out of the pandemic, and I'll use that because I think it's an easy, calendar marker for so many of us, we really started to see turnover start to move the opposite direction, meaning an increase in turnover. And, at the same time, knowing that, the majority of our employees are professional drivers or those with a commercial driver license, that were becoming less and less available, whether they retired, they got pulled into e-commerce, whatever the case may be. We also know that in solid waste in particular, we have one of the most difficult jobs and certainly the most dangerous. Solid waste today is seventh most deadliest industry in the United States. So we couldn't and knew that we wouldn't recruit our way to long-term sustainable success by elevated turnover and simply relying on to recruit the next driver coming in. More so, as an organization, our first value is safety, and particularly in the solid waste industry. I told you a minute ago how dangerous and dynamic it can be. Big trucks, obviously. We know that the most significant life-changing events that occur within our organization are from those new hire employees. So we wanted to do more to keep those that we wanted to keep on the team while maintaining our performance-based culture. Again, going back to servant leadership, sometimes people think it's an easy or soft leadership. We're very much a performance-based culture. So we still make cuts, meaning when those employees that don't deserve to be on our team any longer, primarily most cases from a safety standpoint, we make a strong decision and we make it swiftly, because for them, they don't deserve to be on our team. So as we're thinking about now, hey, how do we put together, or how do we improve the level of retention that we have within the organization? Quite candidly, Sue Netherton, who's our SVP of People Training and Development, and I sat down and did a number of brainstorming. And the company's done some things in the past that were mildly successful. And I joked with just about anybody that I would run into. If they were talking about retention, I would listen. That's when we started talking about C-suite, specifically the Finnegan's Arrow, that Sue, one of my coworkers, had seen. And I just started digging into it and had an exploratory call, had some conversation. But what really hooked me was the stay interview portion of it. And, as an organization, we had talked about stay interviews in the past. But what I liked about stay interviews in particular was it was really about building trust, building on that relationship with the employee, listening to learn more about your employee and what you can do for them, which frankly is servant leadership. I mean, there's such a strong parallel there that I knew that as strong as servant leadership was in our organization, yes, we talked about stay interviews at a very low level before. Now, all of a sudden, C-suite offers us these 5 questions based on science with this defined cadence, if you will, which is, call it cadence or discipline around the timing of who to ask and when to ask these questions. It was a natural fit that I thought, hey, let's run with this. And what we did, well, let me pause for a second. So we engaged with C-suite. We also went out to our best locations throughout the organization and asked them specifically what they were doing, knowing how strong their retention was at that time. They were outperforming some of our other folks within the organization, keeping in mind we're a very decentralized organization. So, as you think about it, we certainly have boundaries and expectations, particularly as a public company. But the way and how we do many things are really the beauty of our decentralization. So not everyone did everything exactly the same, right? Taking the Finnegan's Arrow and the stay interview kind of C-suite tools that they had given us, also putting it together with, call it, 2 other kind of phases or modules, if you will, is really how we kind of built this defined development around retention. And I just went out to our senior leaders and said, we've got something to offer here that I think will work. Here's why I think it will work, because our best do part of it, and the specifically the C-suite analytics piece is such a natural tie into servant leadership. We needed to do something different, not everywhere, but we needed to do something different for those locations that were struggling with retention. We effectively put this together and rolled it out on a trial basis with our first group, which was what we call districts. So districts for us is a BU or a market area or a general manager that's running this entire business. Geography can be a little bit loosely defined on a district, but we started in July of 2021 with 21 districts, encompassing about 27 to 2,800 employees. That group in its entirety was almost 40% turnover. 70% of that was voluntary. And if you fast forward the clock to today, that group today has turnover that's 6 times better than the company average in the same measurement period. Voluntary turnover is performing the entire company by 2x, and all increments of new hire retention are better, anywhere from about 650 basis points to almost 50% if you hit the 1 year. So really strong improvement on the group that I said, hey, I think this will work. We brought a second group in July of 22, similar size, 26 districts, 2,500 employees, higher turnover. So they were north of 40, call it 43% turnover, and now 71% voluntary turnover within there. Now, kind of rounding the clock, if you will. So they're 8 months in, their turnover is 2x better. Their voluntary is 2x better. and all increments of new hire retention up to 120 days, because we haven't quite got there, have improved between 50 to 300 basis points. Again, we know that this works. I think what we've learned along the way here is, we've always been an organization that will continue to focus on continuous improvement. And for us, I think, we believe there's a strong parallel between business and sports, and those that position their team best, come game time, or in our case, on a daily basis, win. So, while some other organizations may have said, hey, this is the new normal, we've kind of doubled down and said, we're going to raise the bar, specifically on our leadership and our frontline leadership, to improve retention so that ultimately the company can be as successful as it can be long term. So, we stepped back in many cases and understood there were some things that were going on, I'll say, beyond leadership. And Mr. Finnegan's very clear about, what the dinner time conversation is, and where he thinks pay ranks. We had some markets where we had to address pay, because what I've learned, even with some really strong and impactful stay interviews, you got to be competitive on wages, benefits, and working conditions. And I'll use working conditions kind of globally, right?
Right.
And for us, it was there was a number of things that we learned. I think it opened and forced some broader conversations beyond retention, turnover, and relationships that ultimately impacted retention. It always starts, or should start, certainly does at Waste Connections, with a model of self-reflection on the leadership standpoint to begin with. But I think beyond kind of reflecting from a first off a leadership role position, don't underestimate the time that it takes to do a quality stay interview. We range in kind of duration, if you will, in a stay interview. I think, in my opinion, with a strong leader, you can do one pretty quickly, without it just being, slammed down, ripped through the interrogation and gone. I think you can do a quality stay interview, but there is certainly some time around, preparation and follow up. And at times employees will talk longer than maybe what's necessary. So don't underestimate the time. You certainly got to be organized, particularly as you start thinking about, after you do the stay interview and start forecasting retention and having a discussion internally about forecasted retention and accuracy and what we miss. You have to be organized. You got to remain true to the intent of questions. Ultimately, I think, as anything in life, don't ask the question unless you want the answer. And for us specifically, if an employee gives you some feedback about, what else they'd like to be doing here, or, when some specific feedback about around the last time they thought about leaving the team, whatever it may be, you got to be accountable to that feedback. And there have been times over the last couple of years where one of our locations said, hey, I had to stop asking the stay interview questions for a while because I couldn't get back to the feedback. And I don't love that answer, because it means we weren't in a great spot at that point. But I certainly appreciate, there's a certain level of integrity that goes with this engagement and the conversation. Don't ask the question and be accountable for the feedback unless you can follow up on it, right? Otherwise, you've wasted, in my opinion, the entire opportunity around the stay interview process and the forecasting of retention.